Not everything in the world is what it seems. Did you know that France's longest border is not in Europe? Or that Everest is not the closest point to space? Well, some geographical truths defy common sense and prove that the planet hides unexpected surprises. These discoveries are not just curiosities to impress your friends. They show that real knowledge goes beyond the obvious. Chile is narrower than it seems. Iceland has more forests than Greenland, and Spain has a city in Africa. Details that completely change the way we see the world. If you think you already know everything about geography, wait until you see these geographical curiosities that will challenge your certainties. Ready to rethink what you thought you knew? When you think of France, most people imagine the Eiffel Tower, Paris, the vineyards of Bordeaux, or even the snow-capped Alps. But few know that the country's longest border is not in Europe, but in South America. French Guiana, an overseas territory of France, shares an impressive 730 kilometers of border with Brazil. For comparison, the border between France and Spain, which many believe to be the longest, is only 623 kilometers long. In other words, the territorial connection between France and Brazil is greater than with any other European country. One of those geographical curiosities that defy common sense. And the most interesting thing, French Guiana is not a colony or an independent country, but a piece of France, with the euro as its official currency, education in French, and even the presence of the European Space Agency, which launches rockets from Kourou into space. This means that, technically, you can travel from France to Brazil without even leaving France. If you ever set foot in Cayenne, the capital of French Guiana, you will feel like you are in a tropical corner of Europe, but with the Amazon rainforest in the background. A contrast worthy of a movie. Now, here's a curious detail. Since French Guiana is a European territory in South America, football also follows this peculiar logic. The local team plays in continental competitions in America, but because it is part of France, it cannot play in the FIFA World Cup. These are the paradoxes that make geographical curiosities so fascinating. And speaking of unexpected curiosities about territories and places, did you know that the closest point in space is not Everest? Well, and the explanation for this is surprising. Everyone learns in school that Mount Everest is the highest mountain in the world, at an impressive 8,848 meters high. But what if I told you that it is not the closest point to space? Well, this is one of those geographical curiosities that dismantles what everyone believes to be true. The real champion is Chimborazo, a volcano in Ecuador. But how is this possible? Simple, the Earth is not a perfect sphere, but a geoid that is slightly flattened at the poles and wider at the equator. Since Chimborazo is close to the equator, it takes advantage of this natural protuberance and projects further into space than Everest. If you climbed to the top of Chimborazo, you would be approximately 2 kilometers further from the center of the Earth than if you were at the summit of Everest. And Chimborazo is not even close to Everest's altitude. It is only 6,263 meters. But, thanks to the curvature of the planet, its peak juts out higher when measured from the center of the Earth. This detail completely changes our view of what it means to be taller, don't you think? Imagine a marathon runner who runs 42 kilometers on a straight track and another who runs 40 kilometers on a steep climb. Who ran the greater distance? It depends on your point of view. And here's an even more curious fact. Due to this bulge of the Earth at the equator, if you want to weigh a little less without having to diet, all you have to do is move to that region. Gravity is a little less there, reducing your weight on the scale. Small details that make all the difference. But since we're talking about impressive numbers and their influence on a country, did you know that a single company can represent 20% of an entire country's GDP? Yes, and this happens in South Korea with Samsung. When it comes to technology, Samsung is one of the first names that comes to mind. But what many people don't know is that this giant isn't just a manufacturer of cell phones and electronics. It's practically the backbone of the South Korean economy. Samsung accounts for around 20% of South Korea's GDP, an impressive number for a single company. To put that into perspective, imagine if Apple was responsible for a fifth of the United States economy. Samsung's influence goes far beyond smartphones. It is present in sectors such as shipbuilding, engineering, biotechnology, and even the development of smart cities. In practice, Samsung has shaped the development of South Korea. In the post-war period, the country was one of the poorest in the world, but it invested in innovation and industrial growth, and Samsung was one of the main drivers of this progress. Today, the brand has a veritable empire, with interests in banks, hospitals, and even the entertainment industry. If you've ever watched a K-drama or heard a K-pop hit, you can bet that Samsung was involved in some way, whether through sponsorships or the infrastructure that allowed South Korean culture to grow around the world. What's more, in South Korea, getting a job at Samsung is almost like winning the lottery. The selection processes are rigorous, and many young people spend years preparing for a job. The company's impact on the country is so great that any change in its stock market shares can directly affect the national economy. It's a unique case of economic dependence between a country and a corporation. But Samsung isn't the only example of something unexpected in the world. Did you know that Spain has a city in Africa? That's right, Ceuta is a piece of Europe on the African continent, and its history is fascinating. When we think of Spain, places like Madrid, Barcelona, and the famous tapas and paella cuisine immediately come to mind. But what few people know is that a piece of Spain is in Africa. Ceuta, a small city located in the north of the African continent, belongs to Spain and is administered as an integral part of the country, just like any other Spanish city. Separated from the Iberian Peninsula by the Strait of Gibraltar, Ceuta is one of the last European possessions in Africa, carrying a history full of disputes between empires and cultures over the centuries. Walking around Ceuta is a curious experience. You are in Africa, but you see Spanish flags waving, hear the Spanish language, and pay for your purchases in euros. The city has a strong military presence and is considered a strategic point for Spain, serving as a link between Europe and Africa. But not everything is peaceful there. Due to its proximity to Morocco, Ceuta has been the scene of intense debates about immigration. Many refugees try to cross the border in search of a better life in Europe, making the city one of the most monitored points on the continent. And here's a curious detail. Ceuta is not the only Spanish city in Africa. There is also Melilla, another autonomous Spanish city located on the coast of Morocco. These regions are remnants of the colonial period and continue to be the target of diplomatic disputes between Spain and Morocco. It's fascinating how maps hide little-known stories, isn't it? And speaking of geographical surprises, did you know that Iceland has many more forests than Greenland? Believe it or not, the difference is huge. If the name Greenland conjures up images of vast expanses of green, forget it. Although the name means green land, the reality is quite different. Greenland has just 2.2 square kilometers of forest, roughly the size of a few football pitches. Iceland, known for its volcanic landscape and cold climate, surprisingly has 1,800 square kilometers of forest, an infinitely larger number. But how is this possible? The answer lies in climate and history. Greenland is covered by a gigantic ice sheet, while Iceland, despite its cold, has land that is more favorable to vegetation growth. In the past, Iceland was much greener than it is today. When the Vikings arrived there more than 1,000 years ago, about 40% of Iceland's territory was covered by forests. However, uncontrolled deforestation and heavy grazing have devastated the local vegetation, making Iceland one of the most eroded countries in the world. Today, the Icelandic government has ambitious reforestation programs to recover some of the lost vegetation. If you visit Iceland, you can even participate in the planting of trees, a curious experience in a country where strong winds and volcanic soil defy any ecological initiative. Meanwhile, Greenland remains a polar desert. Most of its surface is covered by ice and snow, making it almost impossible for forests to grow. But even without trees, Greenland has its environmental importance. Its ice sheet is essential for the planet's climate balance. It's curious how names and realities can be so different, don't you think? And speaking of names with unexpected origins, did you know that Papua New Guinea has a name directly inspired by Africa? The story behind it is surprising. When we talk about Papua New Guinea, the first image that comes to mind may be of an exotic place, full of dense forests and isolated tribes. But what few people know is that the name of this country has a direct connection to Africa. The word Papua comes from a term used to describe the curly hair of the local inhabitants, similar to that of African people. New Guinea was inspired by Guinea, a region in West Africa, because European explorers believed that the natives of the island had physical characteristics similar to Africans. In other words, the name of Papua New Guinea was based on the appearance of its people. This connection may seem unusual, but it is not the only one. World history is full of names that were given by European explorers without any real connection to the regions named. America itself, for example, is named after the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, while Australia was once called New Holland by the Dutch. The choice of names has always had a cultural and even economic impact. The fact that Papua New Guinea is associated with Africa influenced the way it was seen and treated during European colonization. Today, Papua New Guinea is one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world, with over 800 languages spoken, a true paradise for those who love linguistics and indigenous cultures. Its biodiversity is also impressive, with species of plants and animals that exist nowhere else on the planet. And if we talk about curious geographies, Chile is another impressive example. Did you know that it is so narrow that it could fit between Iceland and the Faroe Islands? This peculiarity makes Chile a unique country in many ways. Looking at the map, Chile already looks like an elongated country, but when you analyze the numbers, the situation becomes even more curious. With a length of 4,300 kilometers from north to south, it stretches across almost half of South America. But what about its width? That's the big surprise. Chile is, on average, only 177 kilometers wide. To give you an idea, it would fit comfortably between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, two small regions in the North Atlantic. In some parts, its width is so narrow that it is possible to travel from the Pacific Ocean to the border with Argentina in just a few hours by car. This unusual shape makes Chile a country of extreme contrasts. While the north is home to the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places in the world, the south is full of fjords, glaciers, and snow-capped mountains. This means that, in a single day, it is possible to go from a scorching desert to a region with a polar climate. The narrow shape also influences the country's logistics and infrastructure, making the Pan-American Highway a vital hub for connecting different regions. Without it, traveling from one end of Chile to the other would be a real challenge. But what explains this peculiar shape? Chile is squeezed between the Pacific Ocean and the imposing Andes Mountains, which act as a natural barrier. This has guaranteed the country geographic protection against invasions in the past, but it has also left it vulnerable to earthquakes and tsunamis, as it is located in one of the most active seismic regions on the planet. Even so, Chile has become a powerhouse in Latin America, balancing its challenging geography with impressive development. And speaking of challenges and surprises, how about we explore some little-known geographic curiosities around the world? The world is full of surprises, and now you know some that defy common sense. But what if this is just the tip of the iceberg? If even geography hides truths, how many other certainties could be wrong? Knowledge is not just for entertainment, it changes the way we see the world. So, how about continuing to explore and discover more? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are still many incredible curiosities waiting for you.